Imagine boarding a plane with your children, excited for a long-awaited trip, only to watch them humiliated and dragged from seats you rightfully purchased, all because of the color of their skin. How would you react? Would you sit in silence, or would you fight back against a billion-dollar corporation determined to protect its image at any cost? This is the story of Malik Johnson, a calm but unshakably strong father, and his two children, Nia and Xavier, who were told they didn't belong in first class. What began as a moment of painful discrimination soon spiraled into one of the most explosive reckonings in airline history. Within hours, Malik transformed his family's humiliation into a movement, forcing an entire industry to face its darkest truths. But here's the question that lingers. What happens when the fight for dignity collides with corporate power, viral outrage, and systemic injustice hidden inside technology itself? And could one father's refusal to stay silent be enough to change the rules for every passenger, everywhere? Stay with us, because this is not just a story about an airline. It's about accountability, courage, and the price of dignity. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss stories that challenge, inspire, and spark change. The quiet hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, a steady reminder that they were soaring above the clouds. Malik Johnson, the CEO of Skylink Airways, sat in the first-class section of his company's flagship flight, surrounded by the luxury and opulence that came with his status. The plush seats, polished wood accents, and the quiet murmur of the attendants working smoothly in the background were the very essence of his success, hard-earned, meticulously planned, and now a symbol of his family's legacy. Beside him sat his two children, Nia and Xavier, nestled comfortably in their first-class seats. Nia, at 14, was already showing signs of inheriting her father's quiet strength and intelligence, her eyes always scanning her surroundings with the sharpness of someone who understood the weight of being seen, even at her young age. Xavier, only 11, was the more carefree of the two. His energy filled the air around him, though he shared his sister's awareness, even if it wasn't as overt. Malik glanced over at them, his heart swelling with pride. These were his children, his reason for everything. But even in this moment of quiet pride, a deep knot of unease tightened in his chest. They were flying on a routine trip from New York to San Francisco. But today, something felt different. His intuition told him that this flight would not be like the others. As the plane ascended higher, an interaction began to unfold just ahead of them, in the first-class cabin. Sarah Turner, a flight attendant with a reputation for being precise and efficient, approached Nia's seat. At first, it seemed like just another routine check, but the words that came next struck a chord. Sarah's voice was polite, but it held a tone of superiority that was difficult to ignore. "Excuse me, dear. I'll need you to vacate this seat for another passenger," Sarah said, her eyes flicking toward the seat next to Xavier, where a businessman in his early 40s had just boarded. Nia, momentarily confused, looked up at her father, but Malik's eyes were already fixed on the situation, his body language steady and unreadable. He could tell that this wasn't about the seat assignment at all. It was about something deeper, something unspoken. Nia hadn't done anything wrong. She was a paying passenger, just as entitled to that seat as anyone else in the cabin. Yet Sarah's insistence that she vacate it seemed more about power than anything else. "Excuse me," Nia asked, her voice polite but firm. "This is my seat. I'm not moving." Sarah's smile remained fixed, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's just for a moment, dear. I'm sure you wouldn't want to cause any trouble, would you?" she replied, her words veiled in passive aggression. The air around them shifted. Malik felt the familiar pang of discomfort, the kind that had followed him throughout his life as he had navigated a world that seemed to believe that people like him didn't belong in certain spaces. But he wasn't just anyone. He was the CEO of Skylink Airways, the man who had built his career from the ground up, rising above every obstacle life had thrown at him. He had taught his children that they belonged, that no seat was too high for them to claim, and they were entitled to their space in the world, just like anyone else. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his children's eyes on him. They were watching, waiting for his next move. Nia, ever the composed one, held her ground. Xavier, on the other hand, was starting to fidget, sensing the tension in the air. He looked up at Malik with wide, worried eyes, his small hands gripping the armrest, trying to make sense of what was happening. Malik caught his gaze, giving him a small but reassuring smile. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. Xavier didn't yet know it, but this moment, this confrontation, would shape him in ways he couldn't fully understand yet. Malik knew that his children were being tested not just by the actions of Sarah Turner, but by the world they were about to inherit. This wasn't just a simple case of discrimination. It was a reflection of the larger insidious forces that had been at play for far too long. But even as Malik's mind raced with the implications of what was happening, his emotions remained steady. He wasn't going to react with anger or frustration. No. He had learned long ago that the greatest strength came from remaining calm in the face of adversity. Malik Johnson had spent years building this empire. But more importantly, he had spent years preparing his children for the challenges they would inevitably face. Today was no different. Nia, stay in your seat, Malik said softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to quiet the tension in the air. He turned his gaze toward Sarah, who now stood at the edge of their row, waiting for a response. Sarah's smile faltered as she tried to maintain her composure. Sir, I'm afraid I must insist. Then I'll have to insist that you find another seat for that passenger. Malik interrupted, his voice calm but firm. This is my daughter's seat, and she is not moving. For a moment, there was silence. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade as everyone on the plane waited for the next move. Is there a problem here? A deep voice came from the aisle, interrupting the silence. It was John Carmichael, a frequent flyer on Skylink, who had been listening intently. His eyes flicked toward Malik, then back at Sarah. No problem at all, Sarah stammered, quickly retreating back down the aisle. She was no longer in control of the situation, and she knew it. Malik turned his attention back to his children, offering them both a smile that was meant to reassure them. You did well, Nia, he said, his tone warm. He could feel Xavier's eyes on him, full of questions. Malik wanted to answer them, to explain the complexity of the situation, but he knew this moment wasn't the time for long talks. But Nia's voice broke through the quiet before he could respond. Dad, why did she think we didn't belong there? Malik met his daughter's gaze, a familiar weight settling on his chest. Because some people are still learning that everyone belongs. But don't worry about that. The world will catch up to you. For now, though, the battle was just beginning. Malik could feel the shift in the atmosphere around him. The eyes of everyone in the first-class cabin were on him and his children. What would they do next? How would they react to this moment of public humiliation? Malik's mind raced as the flight continued on its course. He knew one thing for sure. Skylink Airways would not be the same after today. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, as Malik Johnson sat in his first-class seat, his mind racing. The brief exchange with Sarah Turner had left him with a sense of unease that he couldn't shake off. As the plane cruised towards San Francisco, Nia and Xavier were still adjusting to the uncomfortable silence that had enveloped the cabin. Malik knew that the incident wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was a microcosm of the bigger problem, something he had experienced throughout his life, but never so directly in front of his children. He glanced over at Nia, who was sitting quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had always been composed beyond her years, and even now, in the face of this awkward encounter, she wore the same calm demeanor that Malik admired so much. But he knew that inside. She was processing the events in her own way. She had learned to hold her ground from a young age, but how could he explain to her the deeper implications of this kind of discrimination? How could he teach her that sometimes the fight for dignity was far more complicated than it seemed? Xavier, on the other hand, wasn't as composed. He was fidgeting in his seat, his eyes darting around the cabin, trying to make sense of the strange tension between the flight attendants and their family. Malik knew that his son's mind was racing, trying to piece together why someone would treat them this way, and why, as a child, he was being thrust into the reality of systemic racism so early in life. The truth was, Malik had always known that this moment would come. He had been preparing for it, in his own way, for years. He had built his company, Skylink Airways, from the ground up, not just to provide jobs and opportunity, but as a statement, an example of what could be achieved when people refused to accept the status quo. But even now, as a successful black CEO, he understood that the world didn't always view him, or his children, the same way that others might see them. They would always have to work harder, fight harder, and prove themselves again and again, not because they weren't capable, but because of who they were. It had been that way for Malik since the beginning. From the moment he'd stepped into the world of corporate aviation, he'd faced challenges that others might not even begin to understand. He had been questioned, doubted, and underestimated at every turn, but he had always known that the only way to truly succeed was to remain calm, composed, and relentlessly focused on his goal. But now, here he was, confronted with the same ugliness of discrimination he had worked so hard to shield his family from. And it wasn't just a personal matter anymore. It was a matter of principle, one that would affect Skylink Airways and everything he had built. He could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. "Dad, is this what you meant when you said we have to stand up for ourselves?" Xavier asked, his voice small but full of confusion. Malik turned to face his son, his expression softening. It was clear that the events of the last few minutes had left a mark on him, and Malik knew that it was his job to help guide him through it. "Sometimes, yes," Malik replied, his voice steady. "But it's not always about standing up just for ourselves. It's about making sure that others understand why we deserve the same respect and dignity that they do." Xavier's brow furrowed as he processed his father's words. "But why did she want Nia to move? We didn't do anything wrong." "I know, son," Malik said, his voice dropping lower, as if he were speaking to himself more than anyone else. "We didn't do anything wrong. But sometimes people make assumptions based on the color of your skin or the way you look. And when they do that, they forget that we're all human. We all deserve respect, no matter what." Malik paused, taking a breath as he turned his gaze back to the window, the sprawling landscape of the United States beneath them. The moment had turned into something far bigger than just a family squabble on a plane. This was about something much larger. The systems of power and privilege that had been built to favor certain people over others weren't just theoretical concepts to Malik. They were real, lived experiences, and they were shaping the way his children would view the world, just as they had shaped his own journey. But there was another layer to this. The people on this plane, the passengers, the flight attendants, even the pilots were all witnessing this exchange. Some were likely uncomfortable, others indifferent. But Sarah Turner's behavior had made it clear that this wasn't just about a seat. This was about power. This was about entitlement. And it was also about the moral question that Malik had spent much of his life confronting. What do you do when the system is broken, when the rules are rigged, and when standing up for what is right means risking everything you've worked for? His mind began to race as he thought of the potential consequences for Skylink Airways. They had just implemented a new initiative aimed at fostering diversity and inclusion within their ranks. They had been applauded for it in the industry. But what would happen if the public saw this incident as a sign of hypocrisy? If people started questioning the integrity of a company that prided itself on being progressive, yet allowed its employees to treat paying customers this way, Malik knew he couldn't let this moment slip by. He had built Skylink Airways to stand for something far greater than just profitability. It was a company that represented progress, opportunity, and fairness. But now, it was in jeopardy. If he didn't act, if he didn't take a stand, everything he had worked for would crumble. His thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the captain over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be descending into San Francisco shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We expect a smooth landing." Malik's heart pounded in his chest. This flight, this moment, was about to end. But it wasn't over. It couldn't be. Not yet. He had made a promise to his children that they would never have to fight for their dignity. And now, it was his turn to make good on that promise. As he sat back in his seat, his mind began to formulate the next steps. He would have to act decisively, quickly. The future of Skylink Airways and his children's future depended on it. The plane touched down smoothly, but in Malik's mind, the turbulence had only just begun. As the plane touched down in San Francisco, Malik felt the rush of adrenaline that had been building inside him. It wasn't just the physical landing smooth and uneventful. As the captain had promised, it was the emotional descent that had been taking place ever since he'd received the shocking news about his children being removed from their first-class seats. The reality of the situation began to hit him in full force. What had started as a brief confrontation with a flight attendant had now escalated into something he couldn't ignore. Malik stood up from his seat, his mind sharp with focus. His children, his Nia and Xavier, were already gathering their things, but Malik could sense the weight they were both carrying. The air around them had shifted. It was no longer a simple issue of a flight delay or a minor inconvenience. This was a crisis, one that threatened everything he stood for, everything he had built. And it wasn't just a personal issue. It had now become a public one. Nia had her head down, a slight frown tugging at her lips as she scrolled through her phone. Her mind was undoubtedly swirling with questions, most of which Malik had no immediate answers for. Xavier, who had been unusually quiet during the flight, was now glancing nervously at the other passengers. Malik could tell that his son was trying to read the situation, trying to gauge how much of what had happened would stay with him, how much would linger long after they had left the plane. "You okay?" Buddy Malik asked, kneeling down to Xavier's level as the plane taxied toward the gate. Xavier looked up, meeting his father's gaze with wide eyes. "I don't get it. Dad, we didn't do anything wrong. Why did she treat us like that?" Malik sighed, his heart aching as he looked at his son. He wanted to shield Xavier from this kind of pain, to protect him from the ugliness of the world. But the truth was, no amount of protection could shield his children from the realities of their skin color, from the prejudice that was so deeply woven into the fabric of society. "I know, Xavier," Malik said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the quiet sorrow he felt. "But sometimes people make decisions based on things that have nothing to do with us, things like the color of our skin, or assumptions they make because of it. What happened wasn't your fault. It was hers." Nia, who had been silently observing the exchange, now spoke up. "Are we going to do something about it, Dad?" Her voice was firm, and Malik couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. His daughter had always been brave, but this was different. This wasn't the typical confidence he saw in her when she excelled in school or handled difficult situations with friends. This was the kind of courage that came from understanding the stakes, from knowing that this wasn't just about a momentary injustice. It was about something bigger, something systemic. Malik nodded, his thoughts aligning with his daughter's unspoken question. "Yes, Nia, we're going to do something about it. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. Not to us, and not to anyone else." The flight attendants were already preparing to deplane, and Malik could see that the gate crew had begun to gather in anticipation. He noticed Sarah Turner, the flight attendant who had caused the disruption, standing by the cabin door, talking with a colleague. He couldn't help but notice the uneasy look in Sarah's eyes as she glanced toward his family. Malik felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He knew that now was not the time for anger, even though it was bubbling beneath the surface. It was a time for strategy, for making his move. They had arrived at a crossroads. What would he do with this moment of power? What message would he send? The wheels in his mind turned, contemplating his options. He could choose to let this slide, let the incident fade into memory, as so many others had in the past. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't be enough. This wasn't about personal vindication. It was about the principle. This was about ensuring that people like Sarah Turner and the systems that protected her behavior understood that they could no longer act with impunity. Malik's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a message from his head of security, Carlos, who had been monitoring the situation from the ground. The message was brief, but it was all Malik needed to know. "The media is already getting wind of the story. It's going viral." He didn't need to ask any further questions. The world was already watching. What he did now would be broadcasted across social media, news outlets, and public forums. The narrative was already being shaped, and Malik had a choice. He could either stay silent, hoping it would all blow over, or he could seize the moment and use it to force real change. He looked down at Nia and Xavier, both of whom were standing close to him now, waiting for direction. Their eyes, though still full of questions, were filled with a deep trust in him. They believed in his ability to make things right, to fix the wrongs they had just encountered. "We're going to make sure they hear us, and we're going to make sure they understand what this really means," Malik said, his voice now a little louder, filled with conviction. "We're going to take action." The words hung in the air as the plane came to a stop. Malik stood up, motioning for his children to follow him. But as they walked toward the door, he paused for a moment and turned to face Sarah Turner, who had noticed them and was now visibly trying to avoid eye contact. "Excuse me," Malik said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that immediately caught Sarah's attention. She turned to face him, her posture tense. "Yes," she asked, trying to hide the nervousness in her eyes. "I want to make it clear that what happened today was unacceptable," Malik said, his gaze unwavering. You didn't just ask my children to leave their seats. You made a decision based on prejudice. And you need to understand that that kind of behavior won't be tolerated anymore." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but the words failed her. Malik could see the uncertainty in her face, the knowledge that her actions had led to a situation that was quickly spiraling out of her control. "You need to do better," Malik added, his voice softening just slightly. "We all need to do better." He didn't wait for a response. Instead, he turned and led his children down the aisle, stepping off the plane and into the terminal, where the waiting cameras and reporters were already setting up. The confrontation had only just begun, but Malik was ready. This was not just a moment for personal justice. This was a moment for systemic change. The terminal at San Francisco International Airport was abuzz with movement, but the noise felt muffled to Malik. The crowd around him seemed a blur, fading into the background as he focused on the task at hand. His mind, now fully engaged in the storm he was about to unleash, raced with thoughts of what would come next. As he and his children walked towards the gate, Malik could hear the faint hum of reporters and camera crews setting up just beyond the glass. He knew it wouldn't be long before his life, already in turmoil, would explode into the public eye. Nia and Xavier walked beside him, both a little hesitant, but also showing the kind of courage that Malik had always tried to teach them. They had grown up in a world that wasn't always kind, and they knew the harsh realities of racism, of unfair treatment, but seeing it unfold right in front of them was a different experience entirely. This wasn't just an abstract lesson. It was their reality, and it was far too real. "Dad," Nia spoke quietly, her voice carrying an edge of concern. "What's going to happen now?" Malik glanced down at his daughter, noting the quiet strength in her eyes. Despite everything, Nia was still the smart, perceptive young woman he'd always known. He could tell she was processing everything, trying to make sense of the chaos they'd just experienced. She wasn't just a passive observer. Nia understood that this moment, this confrontation, could change the trajectory of their lives forever. "We're going to make sure everyone knows the truth." "Nia," Malik replied, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "What happened today wasn't just about us. It's about what's been happening to people for years, decades, and it's time to make sure it stops." Xavier, walking just behind them, piped up, "Are we really going to make them listen?" Dad-like, really, Malik's heart swelled with pride. His son, normally more reserved, was now asking questions with an edge of determination in his voice. Xavier had seen the injustice and was now demanding answers. Malik had always been proud of how his children navigated the world, but this was different. This was the kind of fire that was sparked in the face of adversity, the kind of fire that could change everything. "Yeah, son," Malik said, turning to face Xavier with a reassuring smile. "We're going to make them listen, but more importantly, we're going to make them change." As they neared the gate, Malik could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. He glanced over at the group of reporters who had already gathered, their cameras trained on him and his family. The world was watching. Malik was no longer just a businessman on a flight. He had become the focal point of something much larger. His children, too, were no longer just innocent victims of a misunderstanding. They had unwittingly become symbols of something that had been wrong for far too long. A voice from behind him interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Johnson," a reporter called out, "can we get a statement?" Malik didn't even break stride as he continued walking, his gaze forward. "Not yet," he said, his voice firm but composed. "When the time comes, I'll speak. But right now, we're not here for a soundbite. We're here to hold people accountable." The reporter tried again, but Malik had already reached the gate area. He stopped in front of a group of airline representatives who had been waiting for him. Among them was the airline's chief of operations, Ava Lawson, and a few senior legal officers. The tension in the air was immediate. Ava was the first to step forward, a professional smile on her face, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Johnson," Ava said, her tone measured but tight with an underlying sense of apprehension. "We can assure you that we're reviewing the incident. Our team has already begun an internal investigation." Malik didn't let her words sink in. Instead, he cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Your investigation won't mean a thing unless it leads to real action," Malik said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "It's not enough to look into it behind closed doors. I want public accountability. I want policy changes. I want to make sure that no child, no family, ever has to go through what we just experienced." Ava's smile faltered slightly. She had clearly expected a more subdued reaction from him. But Malik wasn't playing by their rules. He wasn't going to let this incident slide. This wasn't about a personal vendetta. This was about systemic change. "Well, what do you expect from us, Mr. Johnson?" Ava asked, her voice still smooth, but now tinged with uncertainty. "I expect you to take responsibility," Malik replied without hesitation. "I expect you to commit to a comprehensive review of your policies, and I expect you to put in place real safeguards to ensure this kind of treatment never happens again. Not just for us, but for everyone who's been affected by discrimination on your flights." The air was thick with the weight of his words. Ava exchanged a glance with her colleagues, clearly realizing that this wasn't a negotiation. This was an ultimatum. Before she could respond, Malik's phone buzzed. It was a text from Carlos, his head of security, who had been working to ensure their safety in the chaos of the airport. The message was simple, but its implications were huge. The story is going global. Media coverage is already escalating. It's only a matter of time before this reaches the highest levels. Malik's eyes narrowed. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on him. He wasn't just dealing with an airline or a handful of flight attendants. He was standing on the precipice of something much larger, a full-scale reckoning, one that could reshape the way the airline industry handled race, bias, and discrimination. His children were watching him, waiting for the next move, and Malik knew that the eyes of the world were on them. He could already see the flashes from the cameras outside the terminal, capturing the moment. This was a turning point, and it was up to him to make sure that it was one for the history books. "Mr. Johnson," Ava said again, this time with a touch of desperation in her voice, "we're willing to work with you. But you have to understand, this is a complicated situation. There are legal processes," and Malik held up a hand, cutting her off. "No more excuses. Ava," he said firmly, "you've been getting away with this for far too long. Now it's time for you to answer for it." His voice was unwavering, and as he looked at her, Malik saw something shift in Ava's expression. It wasn't just the professional veneer she had been trying to maintain. For a moment, there was a flicker of realization that perhaps Malik wasn't going to let them off the hook, that he wasn't just some CEO with a reputation to protect. He was a father, standing up for his children. "I'll give you 24 hours, Malik continued, his words leaving no room for negotiation. "You have that long to come up with a plan, a real plan, or I'll make sure the world knows exactly what you've been hiding." The silence that followed was heavy. Ava and her colleagues exchanged looks. but no one dared to speak. Malik didn't need to say more. The message was clear. The stakes were higher than they had ever imagined, and it was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. As Malik turned to walk away, he felt his children's eyes on him, their trust in him more palpable than ever. He didn't look back, but he knew that, whatever came next, they would stand together. They were no longer just a family facing adversity. They were a force, and this battle was just beginning. The room in front of Malik felt like the eye of a storm, a space thick with tension, where every word could shift the winds of destiny. Malik Johnson stood at the precipice, the weight of his family's dignity in his hands, the room full of airline executives around him. He'd already delivered his ultimatum. Now, it was time to see if Skyline Air would bend to the will of justice, or if they would risk the ultimate destruction of their empire. The flight to Seattle was long over, but the fallout of that flight was just beginning. Malik's mind raced with every possible outcome, every scenario of what this negotiation could bring. It wasn't just about business anymore. It wasn't even about the public humiliation of his children. This was about changing the very fabric of an industry that had long hidden behind the facade of progress. He knew that today, history could be made. He turned his attention back to the table where Ava Lawson sat, her face unreadable, but Malik could tell she was still calculating her next move. Alongside her were several other senior officers, David Park, the general counsel, and a few others who had clearly been steeling themselves for what was about to come. Malik had delivered his terms, but now it was their turn to respond. It was surreal. He had been here before in a different way, sitting across from investors, dealing with board members over corporate strategy, making tough calls. But this wasn't a business decision. This was personal. This was about something bigger. This was about ensuring his children could grow up in a world where people like them didn't have to fight for their rightful place. The silence in the room was oppressive. Even the hum of the airport outside seemed to have dimmed as the weight of Malik's words echoed in the room. His phone buzzed again, but he didn't check it. He didn't need to. The situation had already become clear. He could feel it in the air. Finally, Ava spoke, her voice measured but tight with strain. "Mr. Johnson," she began, "we understand your demands. We do. But you need to understand the position we're in. There are processes, legal obligations." Malik's gaze hardened, interrupting her. "No more excuses, Ava," he said, his voice as firm as iron. "You've been hiding behind processes for far too long. It's time to face the consequences of your actions." Ava didn't flinch, but Malik could see a flicker of something else, uncertainty. For the first time, he could tell that she knew the game had changed. This wasn't about smooth-talking corporate lawyers or stalling with bureaucracy. Malik wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to ensure that his children and countless others who'd been ignored or mistreated wouldn't have to face this again. "Mr. Johnson." David Park, the general counsel, spoke up, his voice dripping with the practiced calm of someone who had spent years diffusing crises. "We recognize the severity of the situation, but the ramifications of what you're asking for are immense. We can't just—" Malik's eyes locked onto David's. "You think I don't understand the ramifications?" he said, his tone rising. "I've been in your position. I've dealt with crises, legal battles, the politics of running a business. But I'm not just fighting for a seat at the table anymore. I'm fighting for something that matters far more. I'm fighting for my children's right to exist without being told they don't belong." There was a moment of silence as his words landed. For a brief second, it felt like the entire room had been caught off guard. Even Ava, normally poised and prepared, had no response. Malik could feel his heart rate picking up as the realization set in. This wasn't about business anymore. This was a fight for justice, a fight for truth, and it had already begun. "Mr. Johnson," Ava said after a pause, her voice now softer, but still edged with resistance. "We understand your pain. We truly do. But this kind of transformation is not easy. It requires real action." Malik finished for her. "Not more lip service. No more delays. No more apologies that mean nothing. I've lived in this world long enough to know that when people are uncomfortable, that's when they finally start to listen. But you don't get to make that choice for me or my children anymore." Malik felt the rising tide of emotions within him. He wanted to shout, to unleash the full force of his anger on these people who had been so dismissive of his family. But he couldn't. He had to stay composed. He had to remain focused on the bigger picture. The future of his children, the future of the industry, depended on it. Xavier and Nia stood just behind him, the weight of what they were witnessing heavy on them, but their presence a silent reminder of why this fight mattered. The world could be a cruel place, but their resilience, their strength, was proof that change was possible. Malik had taught them how to be strong in the face of adversity, but today they were teaching him how to keep fighting, no matter what. Malik stood tall, his shoulders squared, as the room held its collective breath. The air around him seemed to crackle with tension. He had delivered his demands. Now, it was time to wait for the response. Ava exchanged a glance with her colleagues, and for the first time, Malik saw the cracks begin to show. It wasn't just resistance to change, it was fear. Fear that they couldn't contain the storm that had already begun to rage. Fear that Malik, armed with the full weight of the public support, was a force they couldn't easily manipulate. The time for negotiation had passed. What followed next would decide everything. And as the minutes ticked by, Malik knew that he held all the power now. His children had made sure of that. Finally, Ava nodded slowly. "We'll need time to review the specifics of your proposal," she said quietly. "But I want to make it clear that Skyline Air is committed to addressing these issues. We're not going to ignore what happened here today." Malik could sense the shift. The resistance, the bravado, was fading. Now, it was about survival. And they knew, deep down, that their only choice was to accept the demands Malik had laid out before them. "Good," Malik said, his voice cold with finality. "You have 24 hours. If I don't hear from you by then with a plan that addresses every single one of my demands, I will take the necessary steps to ensure this company and everyone involved faces the consequences." He turned and walked toward the door, his children following closely behind him. The weight of the moment felt heavier with each step, but Malik knew they were not just walking out of a room. They were walking into history, and the world was about to watch. As they left the room, Malik's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't just a text, it was a notification from his legal team. The media coverage had escalated. The story was everywhere, flooding social media, trending worldwide. The tide had shifted. The reckoning had begun. The tension in the boardroom at Skyline Air was palpable as the last few minutes ticked by. Malik Johnson had left the building, but his presence lingered in the room, a storm cloud gathering over the executive team. His demands were clear, his voice unwavering. Now it was their turn to make a choice, capitulate, and begin the process of transforming the company from within, or risk everything by continuing to deny the systematic problem that had been exposed to the world. The door to the conference room was shut. and the hushed voices of executives rose in a cacophony of strained negotiations. There was an underlying sense of fear now, something that had been absent before. Malik had exposed their weakness, the very thing they had worked so hard to cover up, the discriminatory practices that were embedded in the foundation of Skyline Air. The system was broken, and they knew it. The question was, could they fix it before it destroyed them? Ava Lawson sat at the head of the table, her fingers drumming nervously on the polished wood. Across from her, David Park, the general counsel, had not spoken for what felt like an eternity. He was staring at his tablet, furiously scrolling through legal documents and corporate policies. The silence in the room was becoming unbearable, but Ava knew that breaking it would only make matters worse. They were all in the same boat now, and there was no easy way out. "We need a plan," Ava said, her voice tight, as she finally broke the silence. "We can't just wait for the storm to pass. We need to control the narrative before it spirals out of control." David looked up from his screen, his face grim. "There's nothing to control anymore. Ava, the world has seen it. There's no turning back from this. We've crossed a line." Ava's eyes narrowed. "So, what do you suggest we just fold up shop and walk away from everything we've built?" "That's not what I'm saying," David replied, his voice steady but laced with concern. "But if we don't move quickly and decisively, we're looking at something far worse than just a public relations disaster. We're talking about a federal investigation. We're talking about criminal charges." Ava leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had been in the game long enough to understand that power, once lost, was incredibly difficult to reclaim. But this was different. This wasn't just a loss of face, it was a loss of everything. Their profits, their reputation, and their very existence as a company. And it all came down to one moment, one decision, one flight that had gone horribly wrong. "You're right," Ava said quietly. "But we still have options. We can still negotiate, still find a way to move forward with some kind of compromise." "Compromise?" David's voice was sharp, almost mocking. "There's no compromise here. Ava, Malik has made it clear. This is a battle now, not a negotiation. He's playing for keeps, and he's not going to stop until we do what he says." Ava closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had always prided herself on her ability to find a way out of even the most difficult situations. But this was different. She was staring down the barrel of a crisis that she couldn't control, and it felt like the walls were closing in. Meanwhile, outside the conference room, Malik's team had gathered at the nearby hotel, watching the events unfold in real time. The media was buzzing with updates. Social media was ablaze. Hashtags like "No Justice for Malik" and "Your Skyline Air Reckoning" trending worldwide. Malik had become more than just a businessman. He had become a symbol of resistance, a beacon for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of systemic discrimination. Xavier and Nia were sitting together in the hotel lobby, their phones in hand as they watched the footage of their father's confrontation with the Skyline executives. The pride they felt for their father was overwhelming, but so was the weight of what had happened. Their lives had been turned upside down in an instant. It was hard to imagine that just a few days ago, they were getting ready for a normal flight, unaware that the very act of sitting in first class would turn their family's world upside down. "This is bigger than just us, isn't it?" Nia asked quietly, glancing at her brother. Xavier nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Way bigger. This isn't just about what happened to us. It's about everything that's been happening for years, to people we don't even know." Malik walked into the hotel lobby just as his children were finishing their conversation. He stood still for a moment, surveying the scene. His family was together, safe, but the fight wasn't over. The next few hours would determine how far they could push for real change, and Malik knew that, no matter what. They couldn't afford to back down now. "How are you holding up?" Malik asked as he sat down beside them. "We're okay," Nia said, her voice steady despite the turmoil. "But it's overwhelming. I never thought it would go this far." "It has to," Malik said, his tone unwavering. "We've got a chance to do something that matters. Nia, something that will last. People need to see this for what it is, a systemic problem, not just an isolated incident. And the only way to make sure it gets fixed is to push as hard as we can." Xavier looked up at his father, a mixture of admiration and fear in his eyes. "But what if they don't listen? What if they just try to bury it? What if it's too late?" Malik put a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "We make them listen. We make sure they can't turn away. And if they try to bury it, we shine a light so bright that they have no choice but to act." He stood up, his gaze steady. "It's not about winning or losing anymore. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what you two did. It's about making the world a better place for everyone." The storm that had been brewing was no longer just a possibility, it was here, and Malik was ready to face it head on. He didn't have all the answers, but he had his family by his side, and he had the strength of his convictions, and that was enough to see them through whatever came next. The tension in the Skyline Air headquarters was thick, and the clock was ticking. The boardroom, once a place of calm and calculated decision-making, had become a battlefield. Ava Lawson, the company's CEO, had just called a final meeting to prepare for the inevitable Malik Johnson's demands. As she gathered the remaining executives around the sleek conference table, her mind was a storm of thoughts, each more urgent than the last. "We can't keep dancing around the issue," Ava said, her voice carrying a sense of finality. "The world is watching, and if we're not careful, we'll be the ones in the history books for all the wrong reasons." David Park, the general counsel, looked up from his tablet. His face was pale, but his gaze was unwavering. "Ava, you know as well as I do that this isn't just a PR nightmare. We're talking about real consequences here. Federal investigations, criminal charges, the whole 9 yards. Skyline could be out of business in a matter of days." Ava pressed her palms flat against the table, leaning forward. "That's why we need to move quickly. We have no choice now but to admit the systemic issues we've been ignoring." Malik made it clear. "We either capitulate or we're gone." David shook his head, his frustration rising. "Capitulate. Do you know what that means for us? We're talking about federal oversight of everything we do, public transparency, personal liability for the executives involved, and worst of all, public acknowledgement of our past wrongdoings." "And what if we don't?" Ava replied, her voice cold and sharp. "What if we refuse to act? We're already drowning in a sea of bad press. Our stock is plummeting, and every day that goes by without an answer only makes things worse. Malik has the upper hand. He's holding all the cards." There was a long pause, and the weight of the situation seemed to press down on every person in the room. The evidence was irrefutable. Malik had exposed not just the isolated incident with his children, but a systematic pattern of discrimination that had been embedded in the company's operations for years. From biased algorithms in their booking software to discriminatory practices by gate agents and flight attendants, everything had been laid bare for the world to see. "Do we really think we can get away with denying it?" Ava asked, her voice quieter now. She scanned the faces around the table, meeting the eyes of each executive, looking for any sign of resistance, any chance that they might refuse to accept what had to happen next. None came. "We do what we need to do," David finally said, his voice tinged with resignation. "We face it head on. If we don't, we risk not just our jobs but the entire company. We can't survive this without Malik's cooperation." Ava nodded slowly, a deep breath escaping her lips. Then it settled. "We accept his terms. We take responsibility, implement reform." And she paused, the enormity of the situation settling in her chest. "And we make sure this never happens again." As Ava ended the meeting, the gravity of their decision weighed heavily on her. She had never imagined that her tenure as CEO of Skyline Air would end like this. The company had always been a symbol of success, a testament to years of hard work. But now it was teetering on the edge of collapse. And all because of one decision, one act of discrimination that had spiraled out of control. Meanwhile, across town at the hotel, Malik and his children were preparing for the next phase of this unfolding drama. Malik had spent years building his empire, only to see it nearly shattered by a system that had failed to protect his family. But he was no stranger to adversity. As a successful entrepreneur, he had faced his share of battles, each more challenging than the last. But this was different. This time, it wasn't about business deals or corporate rivalries. This time, it was personal. He paced the hotel room, his thoughts racing. He knew what was at stake, not just his company, but the future of civil rights in corporate America. Malik had been pushed to the brink, and he wasn't about to back down now. His children, who had already shown so much bravery in the face of adversity, would not be forgotten. Their courage had sparked a movement, and it was Malik's responsibility to ensure that it didn't die here. "Dad, you're overthinking this," Nia said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her arms folded across her chest. "Everything's going to be fine. You've already done enough. Now it's time for them to do their part." Malik turned to her, his expression softening. "I don't know. Nia, what if they back out? What if they try to find a way to weasel out of this? What if this was all for nothing?" "It wasn't for nothing," Xavier chimed in, stepping into the room beside his sister. "We've already changed the narrative. People are listening. They're starting to understand that this is bigger than just us." Malik smiled at his children, feeling a wave of pride wash over him. They were right. This had become bigger than just a personal vendetta against Skyline Air. It was a fight for the dignity of every person who had ever been wronged, every person who had ever been made to feel less than they were, simply because of their race, gender, or background. "You're both right," Malik said, his voice full of conviction. "But we can't stop now. Not until we've ensured that this isn't just a moment, but a movement. We have to push. Nia, we have to make sure the world sees this for what it is, a reckoning." The next few hours would be critical. Malik knew that once the board meeting concluded, everything would change. He had secured the leverage, but now it was time for him to wield it, and he had no intention of backing down. Malik stood in front of the window, looking out at the city below. This was his moment, his time to reshape the future. He had been given the power, and he was going to use it. He was going to fight until the very end. The air in the corporate conference room was thick with anticipation as the executives of Skyline Air sat silently, awaiting the arrival of Malik Johnson and his legal team. Ava Lawson stood at the head of the table, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed the final preparations. Outside the glass windows, the Seattle skyline loomed in the distance, the evening sun casting long shadows across the city. For Ava, this moment felt as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. This was the hour that would define her legacy, whether she would be remembered as a leader who acted with integrity or one who failed her company and her passengers. "We're in the fight of our lives," David Park whispered, his voice low and strained. "I hope we're prepared for what's coming." Ava didn't respond immediately. Instead, she shifted her gaze toward the door, her mind racing through the same questions that had plagued her since Malik's demands had become impossible to ignore. Had they done enough? With the changes they were making, the public commitment to accountability, truly bring about the kind of transformation Malik demanded? Or would it be seen as a hollow gesture? The company had already hemorrhaged stock value, and now the threat of federal oversight hung over them like a sword of Damocles. But what other choice did they have? The evidence Malik had provided, the undeniable proof of their systemic failures, left them no room for denial. Malik had gone from a vengeful father to a catalyst for national reform. And now, the eyes of the world were fixed on Skyline Air. A knock at the door broke her reverie, and in walked Malik, his presence as commanding as ever. His stride was measured, purposeful, with the aura of someone who had already won, even before the game had started. Behind him were his children, Nia and Xavier, standing tall and composed, despite the weight of the world on their shoulders. Malik's children were no longer just victims of an unfortunate incident. They were symbols of resilience, of the fight for dignity in a system designed to strip it away. "Malik." Ava greeted him, standing and offering a tight smile. Her eyes flickered briefly to Nia and Xavier, then back to Malik. "We're ready. We've made the changes you requested. We've prepared ourselves for the next steps." Malik's gaze was steady as he took a seat at the table. He didn't acknowledge her words right away. Instead, he gave a small nod to his children, signaling for them to take their place at the table with him. The weight of their presence was undeniable. Nia and Xavier sat quietly, their posture straight, their faces calm, but their eyes sharp. They had been through more in a few days than most people experienced in a lifetime. And yet, here they were, poised to witness a historic moment. "I trust everything has been set up according to plan." Malik finally spoke, his voice measured, yet commanding. It was a voice that left no room for doubt. "I'm here because I believe in what we've set out to accomplish. But you know, Ava, this isn't just about what you've done. It's about what you're going to keep doing. Accountability is a process. It doesn't end today." Ava nodded, her nerves fraying at the edges. She had long understood the gravity of Malik's words, but now they seemed more like a prophecy than a suggestion. She glanced at the board members sitting silently around the table. Each one of them had, at one point, hoped this day would never come. And yet, here they were, on the brink of a reckoning that would change the future of Skyline Air forever. "I know," she said, her voice shaking ever so slightly. "And I want to make sure we do more than just comply. I want to lead the industry in reform, in true, meaningful change. But this is going to be harder than we thought. I can already feel the pressure building from every corner. We've already alienated a huge portion of our customer base. We can't afford to lose more ground." Malik's eyes flicked toward the window for a brief moment, his expression unreadable. "If you had listened to the warning signs, you wouldn't have to be dealing with this now. But you didn't. And now, here we are." Ava bit her lip, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always prided herself on her leadership, But Malik's words made her realize just how deep the company's rot had gone. It wasn't just about the technology or the algorithms that had enabled discrimination. It was about the culture, the mentality, the fundamental assumptions that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. David Park cleared his throat, trying to regain some control of the situation. "We've done everything you've asked. The software's been updated. The new accountability measures are in place, and the independent oversight board has been established. We're committed to the transparency you've demanded. Now, all we need is your assurance that we can move forward with the recovery plan." Malik looked at David, his gaze piercing. He could see the fear behind the executive's words, the fear of losing everything, the fear of having their entire empire crumble because of their own failures. It was a fear that was only amplified by the realization that Malik was no longer just asking for change. He was demanding it, and there was no room for negotiation. "I'm not here for assurances," Malik said, his voice low but resolute. "I'm here for guarantees. I don't need to hear about your plans or your intentions. I've seen enough of that already. I need to see the follow-through. I need to see action." The room fell silent as the weight of Malik's words settled in. He wasn't here to hear about plans or promises. He was here for results, and the clock was ticking for Nia and Xavier. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when they would no longer be seen as victims, but as the catalysts for a global transformation. Their father had fought for them, for their dignity, and now they were fighting for everyone else who had ever been made to feel less than human simply because of their race. Ava shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the walls of the room feeling as though they were closing in around her. "Malik, I know this has been hard on you, on your family, and I don't want to downplay that. But I also want to make sure that we're doing this for the right reasons, not just because of the pressure we're under, but because we genuinely want to change." Malik's lips tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. "This isn't about your company's reputation, Ava," Malik finally said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "This is about human dignity. This is about doing what's right, no matter the cost. It's about making sure that no one, no child, ever has to go through what my family has been through." Ava sat back in her chair, realizing that Malik was right. This was no longer just about the survival of Skyline Air. It was about something much bigger, about creating a world where no one would ever have to endure the kind of injustice that her company had enabled. She took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "We're with you," she said, her voice steady now, though the weight of the commitment still hung heavily in the air. "We'll do whatever it takes. No more excuses." Malik didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, his gaze turning toward Nia and Xavier. They had been the true agents of change, the ones who had borne the brunt of the corporate system's failings. He would not forget that. As the room exhaled collectively, the executives of Skyline Air understood that this was not just the beginning of a new chapter for their company. It was the beginning of a global movement, a movement that would transform industries, challenge corporate culture, and demand accountability in ways that no one had ever dared to imagine. For Malik, Nia, and Xavier, the fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, they felt a glimmer of hope, and that hope was enough to keep them going. The night outside Seattle shimmered with the glare of media lights, helicopters circling overhead, and a constant murmur of reporters broadcasting updates. Inside the glass walls of Skyline Air's corporate headquarters, history was being written. Malik Johnson sat at the center of the long conference table, calm yet unyielding, flanked by his children, Nia and Xavier. Their quiet presence reminded everyone in the room what this moment was really about. Two children who had been told they didn't belong, now standing as the catalyst for an industry's reckoning. Across from him, Ava Lawson and her executive team shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The documents on the table, the draft agreements, the compliance frameworks, the federal oversight terms were more than contracts. They were confessions, written proof that the company's very foundation had been built on bias. Moloch's legal counsel, an older man with sharp eyes named Anthony Rivers, tapped the papers with deliberate calm. "We're not here for negotiations," he said evenly. "We're here to finalize the commitments Mr. Johnson outlined. Anything less will trigger immediate action termination of technology services, release of full evidence to federal prosecutors, and a public statement that Skyline Air has refused accountability." The words landed like thunder. Even the air conditioning hum seemed to pause. Ava swallowed hard, her throat dry. For weeks, she had been clinging to the idea that there might still be room for maneuver, some hidden angle that would allow her company to save face. But Malik had left no room for half measures. Every demand was backed by leverage so overwhelming that resistance seemed suicidal. Still, the pride in her chest resisted total collapse. She looked directly at Malik. "You've made it clear you hold all the power here. But I need to ask, what exactly do you want this to look like in 5 years? If we agree to everything, how do you envision Skyline surviving? Or do you want to see us dismantled completely?" Malik leaned forward, his fingers interlaced, his expression steady. 5 years from now, Ava, I want your company to be known not as the airline that destroyed itself through discrimination, but as the airline that had the courage to change when it mattered most. Survival is possible, but it's only possible through transformation. His words hung in the air like scripture. The executives exchanged glances, the weight of inevitability pressing into their chests. Xavier, sitting quietly beside his father, finally spoke. His voice was young but steady, and in the silence it carried surprising force. "When you kicked us out of our seats, you didn't just embarrass us. You told us we didn't belong. Do you know how many kids watch stuff like that and believe it? Do you know how many families give up fighting because they think it's hopeless?" The room went still. Grown adults, seasoned executives, suddenly felt the sharp sting of a child's honesty. Nia added, her tone quieter but edged with defiance. "You almost made me feel like I had to prove I was worthy to sit in a chair my dad paid for. That's what broke me. Not the seat, not the yelling, but the thought that no matter what I do, someone will try to take away my dignity." Ava looked down at the table, her eyes stinging. She had expected Malik's lawyers to press hard, but she hadn't expected the raw voices of his children to pierce her defenses. It wasn't strategy, it was truth, spoken plainly, and it left no room for denial. Malik reached over, placing a hand on each of his children's shoulders. His voice softened, but still carried authority. "And that's why we're here. Because this isn't just about Skyline Air. It's about every system, every company, every institution that thinks it can bury its biases under technology and procedure. Those days are over." Anthony Rivers slid a folder across the table. "These are the non-negotiable terms of agreement. Immediate termination of the staff involved, full-scale implementation of bias detection technology, federal oversight, transparency reports, executive liability, a $100 million education and equity fund, and public acknowledgement of systematic wrongdoing." The executives skimmed the pages, but they had already heard the list before. This time, however, It wasn't a proposal. It was an ultimatum backed by the looming collapse of their entire operation. David Park finally spoke, his lawyer's tone faltering under the pressure. If we sign this, the board will revolt. Investors will revolt. You're asking us to hand over control of our company? No, Malik corrected him firmly. I'm asking you to hand over control of your conscience. The company is already out of your hands. It belongs to the people who fly on your planes, to the families you serve. All I'm doing is forcing you to recognize that. The silence was deafening. Ava exhaled slowly, her shoulders slumping. She realized there was no path left but the one Malik was carving. To resist was not only corporate suicide, but moral bankruptcy. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the tone of resignation laced with the faintest spark of relief. Then we sign. The pens moved across the pages, the sound scratching like verdicts being etched into stone. Malik watched, his expression unreadable, but inside he felt the surge of something powerful vindication. Yes, but also sorrow. It should never have come to this. His children should never have had to bear the burden of proving their dignity. When the last signature was added, Malik stood. He gathered the signed documents into his briefcase, then looked at the executives one final time. This isn't my victory. Don't ever frame it that way. This is survival yours. And if you betray what you've signed here, I'll make sure there is no second chance. He turned to his children. Let's go. As they walked out, the conference room exhaled as if it had been holding its breath for hours. The executives sat in silence, the ink drying on the most transformative agreement the airline industry had ever seen. Outside, the media frenzy exploded as Malik emerged. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, voices clamoring for comment. Malik paused only once, his children at his side. My children showed the world that dignity isn't negotiable, he said firmly. And now Skyline Air has learned the same lesson. This is not the end of the fight against systemic discrimination. It's only the beginning. The crowd erupted, reporters shouting follow-ups, supporters cheering, protesters chanting. The storm had broken, but Malik and his family walked calmly through it, unshaken. The reckoning had arrived, and the world was watching. Seattle's night sky was glowing with floodlights as news networks broadcast the breaking story around the world. Malik Johnson and his children had just left Skyline Air's headquarters, but the reverberations of what happened inside that conference room were already reshaping the corporate landscape. For the first time, an airline had signed away its autonomy in exchange for survival, forced into submission by a father who refused to let his children's dignity be trampled. In the crowded media pen, journalists huddled over phones and laptops, live streaming updates that reached millions within minutes. Social media feeds pulsed with clips of Malik's statement. The hashtags Myak Dignity Unconditional and Car Skyline Reckoning dominated global trends. Celebrities tweeted their support. Civil rights leaders praised the precedent, and lawmakers began calling for similar reforms industry-wide. Meanwhile, inside Skyline's glass tower, the mood was grim. The executives who had just signed the agreements remained slumped in their chairs, their faces pale. The weight of what they had conceded pressed down heavily on them, though in truth, most new resistance would have been futile. Ava Lawson stared at the polished conference table, her reflection fractured by streaks of light. For years, she had been celebrated as a strong leader, the kind who steered her company through turbulence with poise. Tonight, she felt hollow. David Park broke the silence. We've done it. We've surrendered control of this company's destiny. Ava didn't lift her head. No, David, we didn't surrender. We were exposed. What Malik forced us to do should have been done years ago. Her words carried a strange conviction. Some of the executives shifted uneasily. Others nodded quietly. The reality was undeniable. They had built a culture where prejudice was normalized, justified as efficiency, and disguised as policy. And now, the mask had been ripped off. Outside, Malik sat with Nia and Xavier in the back of a black SUV, the car weaving slowly through throngs of protesters, journalists, and supporters. Nia leaned against her father's shoulder, exhaustion finally catching up to her. For hours she had been poised, sharp, determined, but she was still a teenager, still a child who had been forced to face the ugliness of systemic bias in one of the most public ways possible. "Dad," she whispered, her eyes half closed. "Did we really change something tonight? Or did we just survive it?" Malik looked down at her, his chest tightening. "Both," he said softly. "We survived. And by surviving with dignity, you changed everything. That's how movements start. Not with speeches, not with politics, but with courage that makes the world stop and look." Xavier, sitting on the other side, was scrolling through his phone. His young face was illuminated by the glow of the screen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad, this is everywhere. Look at this. Millions of people are sharing our live streams. Teachers are already saying they'll use this in their classes. People are calling us the start of a new civil rights era." Malik smiled faintly, though behind his composure was a quiet storm. He hated that his children had to carry such a burden, but he also knew their voices had become undeniable. The world wasn't just watching Malik, the CEO, anymore. It was watching Nia and Xavier, two children who had refused to bow. As the SUV reached their hotel, Malik's phone buzzed. It was a call from Patricia Whitmore, a senior senator who chaired the Transportation Oversight Committee. He answered, his voice low and steady. "Mr. Johnson," Patricia said, her tone brisk but respectful, "I won't take much of your time. I've been following tonight's developments. Tomorrow, my office will announce a federal investigation into systemic discrimination across the airline industry. What you achieved tonight isn't just a corporate settlement, it's a roadmap. I'll need your cooperation in shaping legislation that ensures what happened to your family never happens to another passenger again." Malik's eyes narrowed, the enormity of what she was saying sinking in. "Senator, I'll give you more than cooperation. I'll give you evidence, expertise, and the technology to make accountability a standard, not a miracle." "Good," Patricia replied, "because this isn't ending here. It's just beginning." When the call ended, Malik sat in silence for a moment. Nia stirred beside him, and Xavier put his phone down, both waiting for their father to explain. Malik finally spoke. "We're not just fighting Skyline anymore. This has become national, maybe global, and we're right at the center of it." Bye. While Malik was having his quiet moment with his family, chaos rippled through Skyline's ranks. Rebecca Hartwell, the flight attendant whose actions had sparked the confrontation, sat in her apartment with the blinds drawn, staring at the glowing screen of her phone. The video of her ordering Nia and Xavier out of their seats played again and again, dissected by commentators, shared by millions, cursed in comments. She scrolled through messages, each one a digital blow. Her ex-husband had called earlier. Their daughter Emma had come home crying after being teased at school. Other parents demanded to know if Emma's mother was the racist flight attendant from TV. Rebecca had tried to explain, tried to tell Emma it wasn't as simple as that. But even she couldn't convince herself anymore. She saw the cruelty in her own gestures on video, the dismissive way she had spoken to children, and there was no way to frame it as a misunderstanding. Her phone buzzed again this time. A message from her airline account. Termination notice. No severance. Effective immediately. Rebecca dropped the phone, her body shaking. In one moment, she had lost her career, her community, and her daughter's trust. Elsewhere, Derek Mitchell, the veteran purser who had backed Rebecca during the incident, sat in a sterile federal office. Across the table, civil rights investigators pressed him with questions, replaying the footage, showing him documents that traced patterns of discriminatory removals he had overseen. He was a former Air Force officer, a man who had once been praised for his discipline and service. Now, he was being asked why he had treated two children with suspicion simply for sitting where they belonged. His voice cracked. I was following procedure. I thought I was protecting the cabin atmosphere. One of the investigators leaned forward, his eyes sharp. Procedure doesn't absolve conscience. Mr. Mitchell, tonight, millions of people saw you strip children of their dignity in the name of procedure, and the law calls that a violation of their civil rights. Derek lowered his head, shame washing over him. For the first time, he saw clearly how blind loyalty to a broken system had turned him into a villain. Back in the hotel, Malik tucked Nia into bed, smoothing her hair as she finally drifted into sleep. Xavier was still awake, staring out the window at the glow of camera lights outside. Malik sat beside him, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders. You okay, son? He asked gently. Xavier didn't look away from the window. I think so. But Dad, when I grow up, will people always look at me and think I don't belong? The question cut Malik to the bone. He pulled his son close, his voice low but firm. Listen to me. Xavier, you belong wherever you decide to be. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise. Tonight, the world saw that. You didn't just fight for your seat. You fought for every kid who comes after you. That's what belonging means. It's not given. It's claimed. Xavier nodded slowly, his father's words sinking in. Malik kissed the top of his son's head, then rose quietly, looking out at the restless city. He knew tomorrow would bring new battles hearings, lawsuits, negotiations, but tonight he allowed himself a moment of pride. His children had faced hate and answered it with courage. That was the foundation of every movement that had ever changed the world. And this was only the beginning. The morning after Skyline Air signed Malik Johnson's 6 demands, the entire aviation industry trembled. Television anchors called it the corporate surrender of the century. Headlines screamed about the precedent. International media analyzed the agreement clause by clause. For some, it was a victory for civil rights. For others, it was the death knell of traditional corporate power. Malik sat by the hotel window, sipping black coffee, his eyes scanning reports streaming across his tablet. Every news outlet had seized on one truth: his children had been treated as intruders in a seat their father had purchased, and the world had watched. That single injustice had snowballed into systemic exposure, corporate overhaul, and a new legal framework waiting to be born. Behind him, Nia stirred awake, rubbing her eyes. She yawned, then padded toward the couch where her father sat. You haven't slept, have you? She asked softly. Malik smiled faintly. Not much. Too much to think about. Nia sat beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. Everyone's talking about us. But Dad, what happens now? What if they just pretend to change and go back to the way things were, once no one's watching? Malik turned to her, studying her face, the maturity forced on her far too early. That's why we don't stop. Change doesn't stick just because a contract is signed. It sticks because people keep watching, keep pushing, keep demanding better. And now, Nia, the world knows what to demand. Xavier shuffled into the room next, hair messy from sleep, clutching his phone. Dad, Senator Whitmore just tagged us in a post. She called us the spark of a new era. Everyone at school is talking about it. People are making videos about us, about what happened. His voice carried a strange mix of pride and fear. He was still a boy, and yet his life had been thrust under a microscope. Malik set down his coffee and put a hand on Xavier's shoulder. This isn't fair to you, I know. You didn't ask to be symbols, but sometimes history doesn't ask, it chooses. And now it's up to us to make sure we carry that weight with integrity. No, Limery? Im ain't im home or wong. While Malik reassured his children, Skyline Air was a company unraveling. Ava Lawson entered the headquarters lobby through a private entrance, dodging the protesters and journalists clustered outside. She had barely slept. The night before, she had signed away her authority in exchange for the airline's survival. Now, she faced the fury of shareholders, employees, and customers all at once. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages, some hateful, some pleading, some resigned. She passed through security, her heels clicking against the polished floor that suddenly felt hostile. Every pair of eyes seemed to follow her. Some employees avoided her gaze. Others glared openly. In the executive suite, David Park was already waiting, his face drawn. The board wants an emergency meeting. Investors are demanding explanations. Half of them think you betrayed the company by signing Malik's terms. The other half think you didn't go far enough. Ava dropped her briefcase on the desk, rubbing her temples. They can think what they want. The truth is, we didn't have a choice. David hesitated, then leaned closer. There's something else. Federal agents are here. They want immediate access to internal records emails, training materials, the works. They're setting up in conference room B. Ava's stomach dropped. It was beginning. The oversight Malik had forced was no longer theoretical. It was operational, invasive, and permanent. She rose slowly, her resolve hardening. Then we cooperate. Every document, every record, every scrap of evidence. We're not hiding anything anymore. For the first time in years, Ava felt oddly liberated. The facade was gone. The pretense had shattered. What was left was brutal honesty, and in that honesty was a path forward. But not everyone embraced that path. Rebecca Hartwell sat in her kitchen, blinds closed, staring at an untouched cup of tea. The news played on the television, replaying clips of Malik's press conference. Words like systemic racism, humiliation, and reckoning echoed through the room, each one a dagger. Her phone buzzed with another notification this time, a local parent group condemning her by name. She hadn't left her apartment since the termination email arrived. Her daughter, Emma, refused to answer her calls. Rebecca's mind was a battlefield. She wanted to blame procedure, training, the company's culture. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Nia's face, a child's face, a face that had looked at her not with fear, but with disappointment. That memory shattered every defense she had left. She whispered into the silence, I ruined Everything. Meanwhile, Derek Mitchell sat in a federal interview room, documents spread out in front of him. Investigators pressed him with calm but relentless questions. His 20 years of military service seemed irrelevant now. His loyalty, once a badge of honor, was being reframed as complicity in systemic abuse. He clenched his fists, trying to keep his voice steady. I didn't mean to hurt them. I thought I was following protocol. The lead investigator leaned forward, eyes unblinking. Protocol doesn't excuse prejudice. You enforce discrimination. And now you have to decide, will you be part of exposing it, or will you take the fall alone? Derek's heart pounded. His family had already suffered. His wife was suspended from her job. His children taunted at school. His career was gone. The system he had defended for decades had abandoned him. He faced a choice: protect his pride, or cooperate and salvage what little remained. Tears stung his eyes as he whispered, I'll cooperate. D. Back in Malik's hotel suite, the atmosphere was tense but resolute. Calls poured in from civil rights organizations, legal advocates, and even CEOs of other industries. Everyone wanted Malik's expertise, his technology, his insight. One call, however, stood out. It was from Elena Vasquez, a strategist and media coordinator who had worked with Malik during past advocacy campaigns. Her voice was sharp, precise. Malik, you've done the impossible, but you need to be ready. This isn't just a corporate scandal anymore. It's a political movement. Lawmakers are drafting bills. Activists are rallying. You're not just a father protecting his children. You're the face of a global reckoning. Malik closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight settle heavier on his shoulders. Then we make sure it doesn't become about me. It has to be bigger than one man, one family. If this becomes about Malik Johnson alone, it dies when I step away. It needs to be about accountability as a principle. Elena's voice softened. And that's why you're the right person to lead it. As Malik hung up, Nia stepped into the room, her face solemn. Dad, I don't want to just be a symbol. I want to help. I don't want people to remember me as the kid who got kicked out of a seat. I want them to remember me as someone who made things better. Her words struck Malik deeply. He knelt in front of her, looking into her determined eyes. Then that's what you'll be, not because of what happened to you, but because of what you choose to do with it. Both of you. He turned to include Xavier, who had been listening silently. You didn't ask for this, but now you have the power to make sure others don't go through the same thing. That's real leadership. The children nodded, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Malik felt something close to peace. At Skyline's headquarters, Ava Lawson stood in front of her employees later that day. Cameras were banned. This wasn't a PR stunt. It was raw, unfiltered truth. We failed, she began, her voice steady though her hands trembled. Not just Malik Johnson's family, not just the passengers you've seen on the news. We failed thousands of people, over years, by embedding discrimination into the very systems we relied on. We failed because we chose comfort over courage, procedure over principle. And now, we will rebuild not to protect our reputation, but to earn back trust. Some employees wept, others nodded grimly. For the first time, the company was speaking without spin. For the first time, it felt real. Oh, my. Dakim Shikar, you both join show. Back in the hotel, Malik stood by the window, watching the sunset paint the Seattle sky in gold and crimson. He thought about the journey from humiliation in a first-class cabin to forcing systemic reform on a global corporation. He thought about his children, their resilience, their pain. He thought about what lay ahead: lawsuits, legislation, resistance, and backlash. But he also thought about the applause of strangers on the plane, the solidarity of passengers who had chosen allyship, the reporters who had framed this not as drama but as history. He whispered to himself, almost a prayer, "This isn't the end, it's the beginning." And deep down, he knew the breaking point had not destroyed them, it had transformed them. The dawn after the storm broke over Seattle was unlike any other. Outside Skyline Air's headquarters, the streets remained lined with cameras, protesters, and supporters. But inside Malik Johnson's hotel suite, there was a different kind of quiet. Nia and Xavier slept soundly for the first time in days, their bodies finally giving in to exhaustion. Malik stood at the window, his silhouette outlined against the pale morning light, a man who had carried both fury and love into a corporate war and won. His phone vibrated on the nightstand. A message from Elena Vasquez. "It's official. Skyline signed the filings with the Department of Transportation at 7:03 a.m. Oversight begins today. Congratulations. This is history." Malik exhaled. Steady but heavy. History. Yes, but history came with scars. He turned back toward his children, remembering the way Nia's voice had cracked when she said she almost believed she didn't belong. Remembering Xavier's wide-eyed question, "Will people always look at me like I don't belong?" Those words had ignited a fury in him, but also a resolve deeper than any contract or lawsuit. He walked over, kissed their foreheads gently, and whispered, "You will always belong, and no one can take that from you again." At Skyline's glass tower, the transformation had already begun. The federal oversight team, led by civil rights attorney Dr. Michael Washington, occupied the executive floor. Digital monitors displayed live data streams from booking systems, boarding processes, and crew interactions. Algorithms that once filtered passengers through coded bias were being dismantled in real time. Ava Lawson walked the corridors with a grim face, but a lighter heart. For years, she had carried the unspoken knowledge that Skyline's success rested partly on discriminatory practices disguised as efficiency. Now, stripped of denial, she felt oddly free. She entered the operations center, where staff monitored flights worldwide, and addressed the employees directly. From this day forward, dignity is our metric, not profits, not speed. Dignity. If any system, policy, or action undermines that principle, it has no place in this company. We will not hide from oversight. We will embrace it, because our survival depends on more than compliance. It depends on conscience. There was silence at first, then scattered applause, which grew until the room was filled with the sound. For the first time in years, employees felt like they could breathe. No more whispered instructions about maintaining cabin atmosphere. No more quiet punishments for those who resisted discriminatory practices. Change had finally broken through. But change was not mercy. In a federal building across town, Rebecca Hartwell sat under harsh fluorescent lights. Her termination had been swift, but now the questions cut deeper. An investigator replayed the video where she ordered Nia and Xavier out of their seats. "Ms. Hartwell," the investigator asked calmly, "when you told those children they didn't belong in first class, what standard were you following?" Rebecca's hands trembled. I thought I was protecting the premium passenger's experience." The investigator leaned forward. And where in your training did it say that children with darker skin diminish the premium experience? Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes. She couldn't answer. The silence was damning. She had no defense, but the truth her actions had not been about procedure. They had been about prejudice, dressed up as professionalism. Down the hall, Derek Mitchell faced his own tribunal. The former purser, once respected for his discipline, was now a man stripped bare. Investigators laid out patterns of removals he had approved, disproportionately targeting passengers of color. You called it maintaining order, the agent said coldly. But order at the cost of dignity is not order. It's discrimination. Derek lowered his head. For the first time, he admitted it. I failed them. I failed my oath. I let my uniform excuse my choices. His voice cracked, and I destroyed my family in the process. The investigators made their notes. His cooperation might lessen his punishment, but the reckoning was unavoidable. Meanwhile, the city outside pulsed with energy. College students staged flash mobs spelling accountability in human letters. Churches held vigils for dignity denied. Civil rights organizations organized teach-ins about algorithmic bias. It was no longer just about Skyline. It was about every system that had quietly encoded prejudice into procedure. At Roosevelt High School, Maria Santos, a social studies teacher, rewrote her lesson plan on the fly. She projected the live stream of Nia and Xavier onto the classroom screen. These two children, she told her students, refused to move from their seats. And because of that, every one of us will fly in a world where dignity is no longer negotiable. This is living history. Pay attention. Her students leaned forward, wide-eyed, realizing they were witnessing a civil rights case study unfolding in real time. By afternoon, Malik and his children were escorted into a conference room at the Utah District Court. Federal prosecutors, lawmakers, and journalists filled the space. Senator Patricia Whitmore presided, her voice clear as she addressed the cameras. Yesterday, one family's courage exposed what has festered in silence for years. Today, we begin the process of ensuring systemic discrimination in air travel is not only condemned, but eradicated. The Johnson children reminded us of something fundamental. Dignity is not a privilege, it is a right, and that right must be protected by law. Applause filled the room, not performative, but deeply felt. Malik placed his hands on Nia and Xavier's shoulders. For all the chaos, he knew this moment was their vindication. When the cameras turned to him, Malik spoke with measured calm. My children should not have needed to live stream their humiliation to prove their worth. But since they did, let this moment serve as a promise. No child, no family, will ever again be told they don't belong because of the color of their skin. We are building a world where belonging is assumed, not earned. The room erupted again, but Malik's eyes remained focused on his children. They were the reason he was here. They were the reason he had fought so hard. Weeks later, the ripple effects became undeniable. Skyline Air's transformation became a blueprint for the entire industry. Other airlines rushed to adopt bias detection software to avoid being the next cautionary tale. Lawmakers drafted legislation that would enshrine these practices into federal law. International regulators began referencing the Johnson standards as a model for global oversight. Rebecca Hartwell faded into obscurity, her name forever tied to a cautionary tale. Derek Mitchell cooperated fully, his testimony fueling federal cases against systemic discrimination in aviation. Ava Lawson, though scarred by scandal, became a reluctant reformer, steering Skyline into an age of transparency and accountability. And Malik Johnson, he returned to his work, but with a new mission. He founded the Johnson Institute for Algorithmic Justice, a nonprofit dedicated to dismantling bias in technology across industries: healthcare, education, finance, housing. His children stood beside him, not as victims, but as leaders in their own right. Nia began speaking at schools about resilience, her voice calm but firm as she told young audiences, "You don't need permission to belong." Xavier threw himself into STEM studies, determined to design systems that honored fairness at every level. Together, they embodied the very future their ordeal had forced into being. On the anniversary of the incident, Malik and his family returned to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The terminal was buzzing, but this time it was different. Murals of Nia and Xavier decorated the walls, painted by local artists. Signs hung from the ceiling. "Dignity is non-negotiable." Passengers paused to thank them. Children pointed excitedly. Reporters snapped photos, but Malik waved them away. This moment was for his family. As they stood near the gate where it had all begun, Nia looked at her father. "Do you ever wish it never happened?" she asked quietly. Malik took a deep breath, gazing at the bustling terminal, now transformed by a legacy he had never asked for, but could not deny. "I wish you never had to suffer," he admitted, "but I don't regret what came after. Because the world is different now, and you helped make it that way." Nia smiled, her eyes glistening. Xavier slipped his hand into hers, and together they walked forward, not as symbols of injustice, but as architects of a new standard. What began with two children being told they didn't belong ended with an entire industry forced to admit its failures. Malik Johnson and his children didn't just defend their seats in first class. They defended the idea that dignity is not conditional, not negotiable, and not for sale. We saw the ripple effects unfold in Airline brought to its knees, executives signing away unchecked power, and a movement born in the glare of viral cameras. But beyond contracts and headlines, the heart of this story lies in the courage of two young voices who refused to shrink when the world told them they were less. And yet, let's be clear, this is not just about Skyline Air. It's about every institution that hides behind procedure while stripping people of their humanity. It's about every passenger who has ever been told they don't belong. It's about us choosing whether to remain silent or to stand up when dignity is on the line. Tonight, as we leave Malik, Nia, and Xavier, we carry a choice of our own. Will we let discrimination remain routine, or will we demand accountability in every corner of our society? If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we'll continue telling stories that not only expose injustice, but also remind us of the power of courage, compassion, and change.